anti-Semitism is. They acknowledge it's rising, and they don't like it. We have, no doubt, a problem, and it must be addressed. But I would argue that anti-Semitism, just based on this research, is not normalized in America. It's neither the old right-wing anti-Semitism nor the new. It's not appreciated by likely American voters, including the BDS movement. In 1790, George Washington wrote a letter to the Hebrew congregations in Rhode Island, in Newport, Rhode Island. And in it, he says that the government of the United States gives no sanction to persecution and it gives no sanction to bigotry and no assistance to persecution. And he says to the synagogue, the Truro synagogue, everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. A year later, in 1791, the Bill of Rights and its free exercise clause of the First Amendment was ratified into the US Constitution. We are now seeing from increase in violent attacks from Poway to Pittsburgh and to New York City. New York City alone this year, from the first 139 days of this year, there were 103 anti-Semitic hate crimes. Not hate speech, but hate crimes. And we're seeing it on campuses, both with BDS and also with the exclusion of Jewish students and organizations, attempt to exclude them from and silence them in the campuses. So it raises the question, are we drifting? Are we becoming more like Europe, which has a recent serious anti-Semitism problem and a very, very serious past anti-Semitism problem? And the purpose of this conference is now, and we're going to do it now, we're going to pivot to Europe. So I'd like to invite Mitch Silber, our first speaker, to address Europe. He is going to be speaking about the UK to the podium. Mitch was the former director of intelligence analysis of the New York Police Department and a principal at the Guardian Group. He served as director of intelligence analysis at the police from 2005 to 2012, where he was the principal advisor to the Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence on Counterterrorism Policy and Analysis. He was responsible for developing and managing the analytic and cyber units and supervised the research, collection, and analysis for the Intelligence Division's entire portfolio of ongoing terrorism-related investigations. He also co-authored the 2007 NYPD report, Radicalization in the West, the Homegrown Threat, and is the author of the Al-Qaeda Factor, Plots Against the West, published in 2012 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. He is a visiting lecturer at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and serves on the Dean's Advisory Board there and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. At the Guardian Group, he has joined forces with former NYPD Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly to study the nature, direction, trajectory, and depth of anti-Semitism in a number of European countries. There are about 12 altogether. On behalf of Ronald Lauder, a New York-based philanthropist who is president of the World Jewish Congress, they have met with government officials, politicians, and a whole range of other experts and representatives of the Jewish community in an effort in Europe to better protect Jews there from violent extremist threats. So, Mitch, I'll give you the podium.
Always have to find the clicker first. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon for this very serious and important topic. Thank you, Nina, for inviting me to speak, and Hudson as well. Really enjoy coming here and be able to share some of the findings. As Nina mentioned, I've been involved in this multi-year project and about 18 months through it, looking to assess anti-Semitism in Europe. And there have been about 12 different countries that we have been to so far. And one thing I can tell you is that UK, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Denmark, Sweden, in every single one, the situation is somewhat different. And when we talk about the right wing, the left wing, and the Islamist threat of anti-Semitism, it's really the nature of the balance of those three. What's ascendant in Poland is different from what's ascendant and dominant in the UK. And similarly, you'll hear about France, but there's a different mix in each of the countries, and maybe with the exception of France and Belgium being pretty similar, for the most part, each one is unique in that sense. I should say the purpose of our project is not necessarily to conduct polling or just an assessment of anti-Semitism. Our ultimate goal is to figure out ways to better protect these Jewish diaspora communities in these different countries. And again, in every country, it's a different situation. In the UK, they're lucky to have something called the Community Security Trust. And Mike Wine, a senior member of that organization, which is really the gold standard in communal Jewish security, helps keep the Jewish community safe there. France, it's a different situation in Poland and Denmark. But I wanted to start out with this slide because it sort of telegraphs what the theme is for the UK. And you heard a little bit earlier with Amanda's comment that the British left and anti-Semitism. And in fact, this was a headline. Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the US, said he would extend an invitation to British Jews who wanted to make Aliyah to Israel. Hopefully it won't come to that, but that shows a little bit of the nature of what we're talking about in the UK. And so the UK is what I'll be talking about today. And, the UK, just to sort of frame things, a country of about 66 million people. We're talking a Jewish population of between 275 and 300,000 people. The Community Security Trust, which does some of what the Anti-Defamation League does in the US in terms of tracking anti-Semitic incidents and then reconciling them with British police, tracked that last year in 2018 that there was a record 1,600 anti-Semitic incidents. So what's an incident? An incident is graffiti, is vandalism, is someone spitting on someone in the street, is someone physically assaulting someone. So there's a wide range from the violent to sort of more passive, but either way, they've been reconciled between Community Security Trust and British Police Scotland Yard. Fortunately, there's a decrease of 18% in physical assaults. And at least, coming from this, from my perspective as a former counterterrorism official, the physical assaults are always what is my primary focus. Just to better understand some of the numbers that Community Security Trust has tracked, you can see, this escalation, this steady escalation since 2007 in the incidents that have happened in the UK, and it's really been this sort of meteoric rise. In terms of, what is the nature of these type of events, you have about 500 incidents where people in public were attacked. You've got issues where there were synagogues, about 100 of the incidents. In schools, about 120 of the different incidents. So there's there's sort of a spread of the different types of events that you might see and encounter that get categorized as anti-Semitic. You see here in this icon, this Twitter icon, it shows some of the different terms that people are utilizing when they're making their anti-Semitic references online. And it sort of, again, gives you a little bit of a clue as to some of the directionality of this. And you see labor in focus there as one of the larger words. But we'll come to that in a few minutes. One of the things about anti-Semitism, well, what are the origins of it? Who's actually committing the attacks? So CST, in their questioning of people who experienced this, said, well, can you describe what the attacker or the offender was like? So, they got data on about 30% of the incidents, so about 500 of them, and they said, well, 300 of them were categorized as white, Northern European, so that was about 60%. 73 offenders, or 15%, were described as black. 64 offenders, or about 13%, were described as South Asian. And then 44 offenders described as Arab or North African. Look, these are people's perceptions as to who they thought committed the attack. So there's a certain amount of, fungibility in that, but it certainly shows that by far, at least in the UK, what people are able to say, they're saying, wow, of these 500, 60% were by people who they perceived as white. So keep that in mind as we move on. Another way to look at this same issue, again, origins, who's committing the anti-Semitic attacks or incidents, the question was, well, what's the ideological motivation of the individuals involved in the attack or in the incident? So you have 84 out of the 270 that had enough information to be able to give opinion on that. 84 far right, 173, so more than half anti-Israel, and 13 out of them Islamist motivations or beliefs. So some data to think about. I think, this is sort of a way to think about the day in general. And a sort of point I alluded to earlier is that really we're talking about a mix of anti-Semitism that's coming from three different directions. And I believe right now it's sort of a perfect storm for Jewish communities around the world. You've got the extreme right in the UK. That was, an evidence of that was this murder of Joe Cox, a member of parliament who was anti-Brexit, not necessarily related to anti-Semitic issues, but just sort of an example of white far-right extremism. In the US, obviously, Charlottesville, Pittsburgh, Poway. And the quote above that is from Bowers, the attacker in Pittsburgh. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in. And a lot of the ideological justification for action from the far right is this concept of white genocide, that they believe that their race, the white race, is being threatened, that they're threatened by brown people. And who are the enablers of that browning of America, browning of Europe? Well, the Jews are the enablers of that. In Pittsburgh, it happened to be because it was the Jews and a Hebrew aid society that had previously helped Jewish immigrants, was now helping immigrants from other different backgrounds. On the far left, we heard about Farrakhan, boycott, disinvest, sanction, Women's March, Ilhan Omar's comments. And I think, that's what we know the far left to be. In the UK, Corbyn's support for Hamas and Hezbollah. Israel, and what's the viewpoint there? Well, Israel's a racist, apartheid, settler colonial state, right? It's anti-colonialist, it's anti-imperialist, and it's anti-capitalist. And that's sort of the theme when you're thinking about the labor, anti-left, and anti-Semitism that we're concerned about. And then the third, Muslim, Islamist, and Jihadi, which is reflected in this German report that you heard about earlier today. Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Muslim Brotherhood. We've had a number of deadly attacks in Europe by terrorist groups, as well as I'm sure when you hear about France, the situation there to a large degree is driven by Muslim, Islamist, and Jihadi threats. And, some of this is historical, going back to tropes to the beginning of Islam. Jews are the enemies of Muslims and they should fear Allah. And some are much more recent, the interplay of Arab-Israeli, Israeli-Palestinian conflict playing out in the streets of Europe. But regardless, these are sort of the three directions we're talking about, and it's the Jewish populations that are in the center. So now to talk more specifically about the UK. I think it's clear to say that anti-Semitism in the UK is at its apex. And anti-Semitism in the UK is often disguised as anti-Zionism. It has moved into the mainstream. It has moved into the mainstream via the Labour Party, via students' groups at universities, and the unions. And ironically, those people who are the purveyors of the anti-Semitism believe in their hearts that they're not anti-Semites. It's one of the ironies of this. And if you have the guts to accuse them of anti-Semitism, they believe that you as an accuser should be cast out. And you see that in the US in some of the intersectionality on university campuses. But when you talk about the UK, you really have to go to 2015, because 2015 is the pivot year. Why is it the pivot year? Well, you lose the Labour Party that was the home for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and the home for much of the Jewish community in the UK, in the way that the Jewish community has been overwhelmingly democratic in the US. And what happened in 2015 is that Ed Miliband lost to the Tories, and at that point there was a power struggle in the Labour Party for who would be the next leader. And the person who won came from the Stalinist fringe of the Labour Party. It's sort of like if you would take Bernie Sanders and mix him with Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. That type of mix is sort of who came to the forefront of the Labour Party. And Jeremy Corbyn, who had been known for being pro-Hezbollah, pro-Hamas, pro-PLO, suddenly was in a leadership position there. And how did it happen? Well, among many reasons, probably the most important is that Labour decided to reduce the membership fees in Labour to just £3. So by lowering the requirement to join Labour to just £3, suddenly you have this influx of new members to Labour and people who had left Labour and come back, and I'll talk about that. But make no mistake, in the Jeremy Corbyn Labour formulation, it's anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. Tony Blair is an enemy, Israel is an enemy, and the United States is clearly an enemy. And what you can see here on the graph, it shows the membership in Labour, and when this change was made and the membership fees were reduced to £3, suddenly you have this increase from 200,000 members to 550,000 members. Now, who were these members? There have been some academic studies and some polling done on the people who, this influx into Labour. Well, number one, they were returning members to Labour who had been more left-wing and didn't like the historical Tony Blair, Gordon Brown version of Labour. But then you also had new members who came to Labour who didn't like politics as usual. And in the same way that Bernie Sanders has that appeal that he's from outside the system, you know, with whatever problems there are with that statement, there's a belief that Jeremy Corbyn was also from outside the system. And for younger voters who were looking for someone to shake things up, there was a certain amount of appeal to Jeremy Corbyn. Now, right now, as of last week, the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK is investigating the Labour Party for really institutional anti-Semitism. And there have been a variety of different studies and assessments being done as to, you know, how this has sort of infected the Labour Party. In the UK, you know, there also is a concern on the right wing of some anti-Semitism. And that's really, you know, whereas the Labour Party anti-Semitism is day-to-day, it's in the media, the right-wing anti-Semitism writ large, beyond just anti-Semitism, has come to the fore as a violent threat in the UK. Again, going back to my counterterrorism days, you know, each year or every couple of years, the UK talks about the number of plots that they've foiled. Right, so recently, the head of counterterrorism, Neil Basu at Scotland Yard said, listen, 18 plots foiled since 2017, 4 of them far right. So 14 Islamist, Al-Qaeda, ISIS type linked, but 4 far right. And that is a sea change. You know, that number used to essentially be 0. So when we think about the far right in the UK, it's not monolithic. There are a couple different elements to it, right? One element, the one that Jewish population in the UK would be most concerned about, is on the right here, the neo-Nazis, right? And you can see by their formulation, a wolf, keep Britain white, and their sort of sayings are, Hitler was right, the disease of international Jewry will eventually end in the chambers. Right, so we know what these are. These are neo-Nazis. They have a group called National Action. National Action was banned in the UK, and this is really the first non-Islamist group banned in the UK for terrorist-type affiliations. They've been creative. They've come up with new groups under new names, Scottish Dawn, NS-131. They praise that murder of the British Member of Parliament, Joe Cox, and there have been a number of arrests over the last few years, close to 30. So that's the violent part that I think is targeted potentially against the Jewish community. Then there's another element that's sort of broader than the UK called identitarians. And essentially, what their view is that, look, they're also concerned about the browning of Europe, except for them, it's not coming from Central America. For them, it's coming from the Middle East, right? So their motto, defend London, stop Islamization. And they believe in this theory called the Great Replacement, which you'll probably hear some more about, but it's essentially something that a French philosopher came up with. And it talks about the idea that, Christians are under threat from these waves of immigration. And to some degree, at least in this formulation, Jews are with the Christians, posed antithetical to the Muslim invaders. So the identitarians don't necessarily look to target Jewish populations, and to date they haven't been, a target for that group. But that's when you think about the far right in the UK. That's still on the fringe, but worthwhile at least mentioning. That's the formulation that I use to think about them. So there have been some polling studies done in the UK. Similar to McLaughlin Group, probably not as up to date, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. But in the UK, BDS is a very strong and important phenomenon. In fact, BDS was designed and created by some individuals in the UK, and they essentially came up with it and went to the Palestinian territories and said, hey, listen, this would be a good way to delegitimize Israel and gain support, in a way that would attract the far left. So BDS can count as its origin coming from the UK. And right now, as you have this power struggle going on in the UK, who's going to lead the Tories on the right, Theresa May stepping down, is there the potential that Jeremy Corbyn and Labour comes into power? This is a very serious issue that has gone from the theoretical to the potentially very real, right now, depending on what happens in the UK with Brexit and this political struggle. So, very timely that we're talking about the UK and this situation. So a little bit on the polling numbers, in the UK, a variety, this is sort of the summation of 5 different polls, and said, what is your view of Jews? And essentially, we're sort of at the below 3% in general. And when I say that, I mean very negative or unfavorable. In these 5 different surveys, generally less than 3% of the UK population said they had very negative. And then, if you extend it to fairly negative or unfavorable, you expand 5–6% in general. So when you think about the UK, it's not a country that we normally think of as overall anti-Semitic, and that's probably accurate. We're really seeing it as this manifestation on the left, and the Labour Party has unleashed since 2015. And, I mentioned early on that, anti-Semitism is dressed up as anti-Zionism in the UK, and to sort of get at that issue, in one of these polls, they said, okay, well, let's ask, the general population certain questions about Jews, and then let's ask those same set of questions to people who we already know are anti-Israel to see, is there some type of correlation, right? So when you look on the left here, you see general population. Jews think they're better than other people, 13%. Jews get rich at the expense of others, 12%. Jews exploit Holocaust for their own victimhood for their own purposes, 10%. But when you move over to the red bars, and those are people, that is the subset of people who have already expressed from the polling an anti-Israel attitude, suddenly you're at 49%, 44%. Jews have too much power in Britain, 41%. The Holocaust has been exaggerated. That quadruples to 23%. So this relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, they're intermingled. And I see Alon Carr in the back, the envoy for anti-Semitism, and I know he's going to talk about this. I've heard him say this, that to think about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are separate, they're not. They're the same. And this sort of, reiterates that point, with hard polling data. So just to sort of wrap up on the UK, from a security standpoint, among the different countries we visited in Europe, without a doubt, the UK is number one, number two, maybe tied with Denmark for, a very serious security regime that protects their Jewish population. Number one, the government provides 15 million pounds, so approximately $18 million to the CST to hire guards, to have volunteers, cameras, a state-of-the-art command center that Scotland Yard sits inside of, and this is, unique in Europe. And CST, is very good at what they do. They're sort of the model that other European entities are frankly trying to copy. And that, as we look at the threat in the U.S., I've been involved in a lot of these discussions in terms of what does the Jewish community need to do in the U.S. Well, hardening the target is number one, and clearly there are some lessons to be learned from the UK and from CST and how they do it, because we're in new territory in the U.S. From the left, from the right, and the Islamists. And action does need to be taken. We can't be complacent after Pittsburgh and after Poway. Thank you.
Just stay at the podium. We have time for just a few questions, and I'd like to, lead off with one. The British government has a minister of universities. And that minister recently ordered a crackdown on anti-Semitic groups on campuses. And Prime Minister Theresa May said that the Jewish society groups were being gate-crashed by thugs, and there were physical assaults on the Jewish students gathering on the university campuses. The university authorities said that they were organized, they were coming and organized by hard leftist groups, and that they were making the students, Jewish students, feel unwelcome on campuses. Is this part of the BDS movement over there? Is that what those campus attacks, actually physically attacking Jews when they gather now?
Yeah, it's part and parcel. There's probably a fair amount of overlap between people who ascribe to the BDS sort of ideology and are on the far left, and it's a phenomena that looks somewhat similar. And today's theme is how does Europe relate to the U.S. The piece that I think maybe relates most closely is the university situation in the UK and the university situation in the U.S. I think Williams College today, there's an announcement that there's going to be federal investigation given the fact that what's going on Williams campus for Jewish students. We recently had this situation in New York City with NYU University. So I think the campus situation, far left, ultra progressive, that's the piece that I'm seeing the most similarity between Europe and the U.S.
Well, that is very frightening. Time for one or two. Yeah.
Howard Marks.
Wait, let's wait for the mic, please.
Yeah, Howard Marks, thanks for your presentation. We heard a lot about the football clubs, so-called soccer clubs in the UK, some of them expressing some very anti-Semitic cheers and razzing players. And could you discuss a little bit about that and how serious is that?
I think it's a bit of it's a mixed bag. I think, to some degree, there may not be a full appreciation for the sort of casual slurs of anti-Semitism and their true impact. But, there are organizations trying to combat that, partnering with certain football clubs to try and get them, to understand that those casual sort of slurs against Jews are not acceptable, that they are anti-Semitic. And that, those are things that need to be eliminated from the football scene, which, is rowdy and beer and alcohol infused, but unacceptable nonetheless.
Okay, just one last question.
Could you please talk about the rise of Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party? He did very well in the EU election recently, and its impact on anti-Semitism.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Isla Brown.
We haven't spent that much time looking at that issue because it's so, fresh really within the last week or so. So I can't really add much on that issue.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you.
Thank you.